Do you like change? It's an interesting thing to ponder if you give it a minute. Many people instantly respond yes or no without giving it much thought. But take a second and really think. Are you a person who is open to and accepting of change, or resistant and closed off to change? Each year, when asked this very question, my students answer in various ways, but the common thread is that most will initially say they like change. When given specific examples, though, many will change their minds to say it depends. For example, most people don't really look forward to those major updates to their smartphones, tablets, computer operating systems, etc. Usually when that update gets pushed through, people are initially quite upset. You can find all kinds of examples of this. For example, Instagram, maybe a couple of years ago, I don't know, I don't use it that often, but a couple of years ago changed the logo of their icon. So people freaked out because the Instagram logo had always been like this old-timey style camera thing, and now it's some multicolored thing, right? And people freaked out over an icon. People initially just aren't going to be necessarily that keen on change in some cases. But do you have traditions in your family? Maybe you do something specific for Thanksgiving or Christmas Eve every year. Perhaps you've done the same thing for your birthday every year for years. It could even be decades. Now think about that long-held tradition. How comforting it feels. How safe it is to know that you have the same routine to look forward to for that time. How would you react if you had to change it? Not given the choice, but forced to change it. Never to do it the same way again. If you're like my students, you may have a visceral reaction to that. Perhaps it was even outwardly apparent. The longer held the tradition, the more difficult it would be to change. 5,500 years ago, civilization began along the Nile in Egypt, in Africa, that would exemplify the ideals and typify the actions of a society steeped in tradition and steadfast in their conservatism. A civilization that would change, at least upon initial inspection, very little over the course of its more than 3,000 years in existence. From the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, through the Dark Age at the end of the Bronze Age, which signaled the end of the Egyptian Empire, and on through the conquering of Egypt by Alexander the Great and the rule of the Ptolemaic Greeks, the Egyptian culture remained. It remained a bulwark against the imposition of outside cultures and religions. Not until the combined prowess of the Roman Empire and Christianity did the traditions of the ancient Egyptians of 3500 BCE fade into what we consider antiquity. Indeed, their famous writing, hieroglyphics, weren't used for the last time until the 4th century CE. Those are some sturdy traditions. The history of ancient Egypt is so long that many people fail to truly comprehend the size and breadth of the history. Discussion of things that take place over long distances of time are hard for the human mind to grasp. So think of it this way. The United States has been around for about 250 years. Just the Old Kingdom of Egypt lasted roughly 700, roughly 3 times how long the United States has existed. The history of ancient Egypt is so expansive, it must be broken up into 3 multiple century-long eras called kingdoms, and then further subdivided into dynasties, and then subdivided again into specific pharaohs' reigns to be able to get both the depth and the width of the history correct. It's an expansive, rich, deep history filled with religion, political intrigue, warfare, culture, trade, engineering projects that boggle the modern mind. People have devoted their entire adult lives to the study of just single dynasties from the history of Egypt and still not uncovered all there is to know. One thing that makes Egypt so confusing to young students who try to delve deeply into it is when things happen and telling the kingdoms and the dynasties apart. So understanding the time of when things occurred. Because the art, writing, religious practices, culture, and even engineering appear to change so little across the span of Egyptian history, it's easy to focus on those times when it did noticeably change and thus miss how much happened in the centuries, even millennia, in between those changes. To get a basic overview of ancient Egypt, there are a few sources better than E.H. Gombrich's A Little History of the World. If you haven't picked up a copy yet, you should pick up a copy. It's an amazing book. You crack open your copy and follow along. Quote, Chapter 3. The Land by the Nile. Here, as I promised, history begins, with a when and a where. It is 3100 BC, that is 5,100 years ago, when, as we believe, a king named Menes was ruling over Egypt. If you want to know exactly where Egypt is, I suggest you ask a swallow. Every autumn when it gets cold, swallows fly south, over the mountains to Italy, and on across a little stretch of sea, And then they're in Africa, in the part that lies nearest to Europe. Egypt is close by. In Africa, it is hot, and for months on end it doesn't rain. In many regions, very little grows. These are deserts, as are the lands on either side of Egypt. Egypt also gets very little rain. But here, they don't need it, because the Nile flows right through the middle of the country from one end to the other. Twice a year, when heavy rain filled its sources, the river would swell and burst its banks, flooding the whole land. Then people were forced to take to boats to move among the houses and the palm trees, and when the waters withdrew, the earth was wonderfully drenched and rich with oozing mud. There, under the hot sun, the grain grew as it did nowhere else, which is why, from earliest times, the Egyptians worshipped the Nile as if it were God himself. Would you like to hear a hymn they sang to their river 4,000 years ago? Glory be to thee, O Nile! You rise out of the earth and come to nourish Egypt. You water the plains and have the power to feed all cattle. You quench the thirsty desert, far from any water. You bring forth the barley, you create the wheat. You fill the granaries and storehouses, not forgetting the poor. For you we pluck our harps, for you we sing. So sang the ancient Egyptians, and they were right. For thanks to the Nile, their land grew rich and powerful. Mightiest of all was their king. One king ruled over all the Egyptians, and the first to do so was King Menes. Do you remember when that was? It was in 3100 BC. And can you also remember, perhaps from the Bible stories, what those kings of Egypt were called? They were called pharaohs. A pharaoh was immensely powerful. He lived in a great stone palace with massive pillars and many courtyards, and his word was law. All the people of Egypt had to toil for him if he so decreed, and sometimes he did. One such pharaoh was King Cheops, or Khufu, who lived in about 2500 BC. He summoned all his subjects to help construct his tomb. He wanted a building like a mountain, and he got it. You can still see it today. It's the Great Pyramid of Cheops, or the Great Pyramid of Khufu. You may have seen pictures of it, but you still won't be able to imagine how big it is. A cathedral would fit comfortably inside. Clambering up its huge stone blocks is like scaling a mountain peak, and yet it was human beings who piled those gigantic stones on top of each other. They had no matches in those days, rollers and pulleys at most. They had to pull and shove every single block by hand. Just think of it, in the heat of Africa. In this way, it seems for 30 years, some 100,000 people toiled for the pharaoh, whenever they weren't working in the fields, and when they grew tired, the king's overseer was sure to drive them on with his hippopotamus skin whip, as they dragged and heaved those immense loads, all for their king's tomb. Perhaps you're wondering why the pharaoh should want to build such a gigantic tomb. It was all part of his religion. The Egyptians believed in many gods. Some had ruled over them as kings long ago, or at least that's what they thought. And among these were Osiris and his consort Isis. The sun god, Ammon, was a special god. The kingdom of the dead had its own god, Anubis, and he had a jackal's head. Each pharaoh, they believed, was a son of the sun god, which explains why they feared him so much and obeyed all his commands. In honor of their gods, they chiseled majestic stone statues as tall as 5-story houses, and built temples as big as towns. In front of the temples, they set tall, pointed stones cut from a single block of granite. These are called obelisks, a Greek word meaning something like little spear. In some of our own cities, you can still see obelisks that people brought back from Egypt. There's one in London, by the Thames. In the Egyptian religion, certain animals were sacred. Cats, for example. Other gods were represented in animal form. The creature we know as the Sphinx, which has a human head on a lion's body, was a very powerful god. Its statue near the pyramids is so vast that a whole temple would fit inside. Buried from time to time by the desert sands, the Sphinx has now been guarding the tombs of the pharaohs for more than 5,000 years. Who can say how long it will continue to keep watch? And yet the most important part of the Egyptian strange religion was their belief that, although a man's soul left his body when he died, for some reason, the soul went on needing that body, and would suffer if it crumbled to dust. So they invented a very ingenious way of preserving the bodies of the dead. They rubbed them with ointments and the juices of certain plants, and bandaged them with long strips of cloth so that they wouldn't decay. A body preserved in this manner is called a mummy, and today, after thousands of years, these mummies are still intact. A mummy was placed in a coffin made of wood, the wooden coffin in one of stone, and the stone one buried, not in the earth, but in a tomb that was chiseled out of the rock. If you were rich and powerful like King Cheops, son of the sun, a whole stone mountain would be made for your tomb. Deep inside, the mummy would be safe. Or so they thought. But the mighty king's efforts were in vain. His pyramid is empty. But the mummies of the other kings and those of many ancient Egyptians have been found undisturbed in their tombs. A tomb was intended to be a dwelling for the soul when it returned to visit its body. For this reason, they put in food and furniture and clothes, and there are lots of paintings on the walls showing scenes from the life of the departed. His portrait was there too, to make sure that when his soul came on a visit, it wouldn't go to the wrong tomb. Thanks to the great stone statues and the wonderfully bright and vivid wall paintings, we have a very good idea of what life in ancient Egypt was like. True, these paintings do not show things as we see them. An object or a person that is behind another is generally shown on top, and the figures often look stiff. Bodies are shown from the front, and hands and feet from the side, so they look as if they've been ironed flat. But the Egyptians knew what they were doing. Every detail is clear. How they used great nets to catch ducks on the Nile, how they paddled their boats and fished with long spears, how they pumped water into ditches to irrigate the fields, how they drove their cows and goats to pasture, how they threshed grain, made shoes and clothes, blew glass, for they already could do that, and how they shaped bricks and built houses. And we can also see girls playing catch or playing music on flutes, and soldiers going off to war or returning with loot and foreign captives, such as black Africans. In noblemen's tombs we can see embassies arriving from abroad, laden with tribute, and the king rewarding faithful ministers with decorations. Some pictures show the long-dead noblemen at prayer, their arms raised before the statues of their gods, or holding banquets in their houses, with singers plucking harps and clowns performing somersaults. Next to these brightly colored paintings, you often see lots of tiny pictures of all sorts of things, such as owls and little people, flags, flowers, tents, beetles, and vases, together with zigzag lines and spirals all jumbled up together. Whatever can they be? They aren't pictures. They are hieroglyphs, or sacred signs, the Egyptian form of writing. The Egyptians were immensely proud of their writing. Indeed, they were almost in awe of it. And of all professions, that of scribe was the most highly esteemed. Would you like to know how to write using hieroglyphs? In fact, learning this sort of writing must have been incredibly hard, as it's more like constructing a picture puzzle. If they wanted to write the name of their god Osiris, they would draw a throne, which was pronounced Us, and an I, which was pronounced Iri, so that the two together made Osiri. And to make sure that no one thought they meant throne eye, they often drew a little flag like this beside it, which meant that person was a god. In the same way that Christians used to draw a cross after a name if they wanted to show that that person was dead. So now you can write Osiris in hieroglyphs. But think what a job it must have been to decipher all that Egyptian writing when people became interested in hieroglyphs again 200 years ago. In fact, they were only able to decipher them because a stone had been found on which the same words were written in 3 scripts: ancient Greek, hieroglyphs, and another Egyptian script. It was still a tremendous puzzle, and great scholars devoted their lives to it. You can see that stone, it's called the Rosetta Stone, in the British Museum in London. We are now able to read almost everything the Egyptians wrote, not just on the walls of palaces and temples, but also in books, though the books are no longer very legible. For the ancient Egyptians did have books, even that long ago. Of course they weren't made of paper like ours, but from a certain type of reed that grows on the banks of the Nile. The Greek name for these reeds is papyrus, from which our name for paper comes. They wrote on long strips of this papyrus, which was then rolled into scrolls. A whole heap of these scrolls has survived. And when we read them, we discover just how wise and clever those ancient Egyptians really were. Would you like to hear a saying written more than 5,000 years ago? But you must listen and think about it carefully. Wise words are rarer than emeralds, yet they come from the mouths of poor slave girls who turned the millstones. Because the Egyptians were so wise and so powerful, their empire lasted for a very long time, longer than any empire the world has ever known, nearly 3,000 years, and they took just as much care as they did with their corpses when preserving them from rotting away, in preserving all their ancient traditions over the centuries. Their priests made quite sure that no son did anything his father had not done before him. To them, everything old was sacred. Only rarely in the course of all that time did people turn against this strict conformity. Once was shortly after the reign of King Cheops, or Khufu, about 2100 BC, when the people tried to change everything. They rose up in rebellion against the Pharaoh, killed his ministers, and dragged the mummies from their tombs. Those who formerly didn't even own sandals now hold treasures, and those who once wore precious robes go about in rags, the ancient papyrus tells us. The land is turning like a potter's wheel. But it did not last long. and soon everything was as strict as before, if not more so. On another occasion, it was the Pharaoh himself who tried to change everything. Akhenaten was a remarkable man who lived around 1370 BC. He had no time for the Egyptian religion, with its many gods and its mysterious rituals. There is only one God, he taught his people, and that is the sun, through whose rays all is created and all sustained. To him alone you must pray. The ancient temples were shut down, and King Akhenaten and his wife moved into a new palace. Since he was utterly opposed to tradition, and in favor of fine new ideas, he had the walls of his palace painted in an entirely new style. One that was no longer severe, rigid, and solemn, but freer and more natural. However, this didn't please the people at all. They wanted everything to look as it had always done for thousands of years. As soon as Akhenaten was dead, they brought back all the old customs and the old style of art, so everything stayed as it had been, for as long as the Egyptian empire endured, just as in the days of King Menes, and for nearly 3.5 more centuries, people continued to put mummies in tombs, write in hieroglyphs, and pray to the same gods. They even went on worshipping cats as sacred animals, and if you ask me, I think that in this, at least, the ancient Egyptians were right." End quote. Egyptian traditions and culture made it through multiple ups and downs throughout the course of its 3,000 or so years as a major power on the world stage. Many of the achievements of the dynasties of the past were seen as blueprints for the great works and cultural achievements of subsequent generations of ancient Egyptians. Remember the Great Pyramid of Giza, Khufu's pyramid, or as they mentioned it in A Little History of the World, Cheops. They used the Greek name. Khufu's pyramid would have been over 1,000 years old by the time the pharaohs of the New Kingdom were digging their tombs in the Valley of the Kings, and those tombs look quite similar to the architectural and artistic stylings of the millennial-old pyramids, at least on the interior. You have to keep in mind that this means that when the most famous pharaoh of all time, King Tut, was being buried in his tomb in the Valley of the Kings, the Great Pyramids had already been around for over 1,000 years. There are a few contributing factors to the longevity of these traditions and cultural hallmarks. The Nile River itself is one contributing factor. The ancient people of the world often based their pantheon of gods on the things around them, in an effort to explain the world around them. The Mesopotamian gods of ancient Sumer, for example, were unpredictable and cruel, much like how the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers would flood in an unpredictable manner, oftentimes cruelly destroying entire communities for what seemed like random or nonsensical reasons. On the opposite end was the Nile, and the Indus River Valley, which we will get to in another episode. The Nile was calm and flooded predictably. Ancient mythologies oftentimes are used by the people who create them to explain the world around them. And one of the things the ancient Mesopotamians had to explain was why their rivers flooded so often and unpredictably and killed off thousands of people every time. The Egyptian mythology also has to explain why the Nile River flooded so predictably, and why it provided so much bounty to them every time it did so. The Nile River is calm. It flows in one direction. It flows easily all year long. It's very easy to build canals off of it. And because of this calmness and predictability of the Nile, Egyptians' lives tended to be more calm and predictable. And so their gods, their pantheon, is reflected in that. The pharaoh himself was supposed to be always in control of himself and his emotions. He was supposed to be calm. He was supposed to be placid like the Nile and predictable. And so Egyptian society takes on this characteristic of the predictable, of the traditional. This predictable flooding of the Nile and subsequent bountiful food harvests made it possible for the Egyptians to accomplish some amazing feats of engineering. These feats of engineering were almost always related to the Nile, the gods, the pharaoh, and Egyptian culture. And so these projects almost universally helped to carve the Egyptian culture into stone, as it were. From Menes' construction of the dam around his new capital city of Memphis, to protect its inhabitants and buildings from the yearly floods, to the monstrous pyramids that took decades and millions of tons of stones, transported in the most labor-intensive fashion by gangs of men with rope and water, to the great temples and tombs of the New Kingdom, they all look to the uneducated outsider like they could have been built at any time in Egypt's millennia-long history. One of the most remarkable ways we know the Egyptian culture endured for an unlikely long amount of time against even greater odds than just the expanse of time itself are the interim periods in Egyptian history. Despite several centuries in their history where their society collapsed, either from internal struggles like the Old Kingdom or after being conquered by the Hyksos after the Middle Kingdom, the religion, writing, traditions, and construction styles all remained important to the Egyptians and changed very little. Indeed, even after the collapse of the entire Bronze Age society. The book 1177 BC, The Year Civilization Collapsed, by Eric H. Klein, covers this in detail, where it covers the collapse of society. It covers the collapse of the entire Bronze Age civilizations. All of them had kind of become intertwined by a system of trade. And it was like intercontinental trade, international trade like we have today. And it was a system where everybody relied on each other. And this included the ancient Egyptians of the New Kingdom. In fact, Hatshepsut and even Akhenaten, who is mentioned in A Little History of the World itself, were all part of this era. And even after the fall of the Bronze Age civilizations, which is dated at 1177 BC, but obviously that's not exact. Nothing ever collapses all at once. Even after that collapse, Egyptian society endured. It endured so much so that Herodotus, the great Greek historian, writing 600 or so years later, is still seeing the ancient Egyptians doing things the way they used to do them. When Mark Antony and Julius Caesar are in Egypt vying for the rule of Rome and winning over Cleopatra, while Cleopatra is a Ptolemaic Greek, she's also Egyptian. And when you see depictions of her, she looks like an ancient Egyptian from the Old, Middle, or New Kingdom. These traditions, the way people dress, all of these parts of society survived. And they survived what was the ancient world's equivalent of an apocalypse in 1177 BC. Imagine, if you will, what the United States would look like today if we were culturally still the same as we were at our founding. Really take a minute to think about it. Men would be wearing powdered wigs and knee breeches, woolen overcoats. Women could wear large bell-shaped gowns made from heavy materials. Our society would still not count women as equals, or people of African descent as people at all. Indeed, if America were ancient Egypt, African slaves would still be tilling the soil of southern cotton plantations, and the intense changes wrought by the Industrial Revolution would be non-existent because they wouldn't have ever adopted any of those new things. It's hard for us to imagine a world like that. In many ways, we crave change much more than the Egyptians, even when parts of us strive to maintain that status quo. There are two towering examples of the power of ancient Egyptian traditionalism, or conservatism, if you will. The female pharaoh Hatshepsut and Amenhotep IV, better known as Akhenaten. Hatshepsut ruled Egypt as pharaoh for 2 decades. What's unique about this? Well, for starters, Hatshepsut was a woman. If you know Egyptian history, then you probably already know that there are several important queens of Egypt who ruled as regent for their young sons in the dynastic periods, and even arguably the most famous Egyptian queen, Cleopatra, ruled on her own, sort of, in the Ptolemaic period. What's unique about Hatshepsut was that she wasn't content being just a queen regent for her stepson, Thutmose III, until he came of age. The succession of the pharaohs could be quite complicated due to multiple wives and a tradition of intermarriage. A simple explanation of the complicated succession that would result in Hatshepsut sitting upon the throne as pharaoh is as follows from the ABC CLIO database. Quote, Hatshepsut was born sometime before the turn of the 15th century BCE. Her name means foremost of noble ladies. Her father, Egyptian pharaoh Thutmose I, had had a son or two by Queen Ahmose, Hatshepsut's mother. But he or they died young. In the complex households of the pharaohs, the succession was never clear, for Thutmose I also had a son by a lesser wife. That son, Thutmose II, married his half-sister Hatshepsut, and succeeded his father as pharaoh. Thutmose II apparently was sickly, and he died after a few years of rule. After he and Hatshepsut had a daughter, Nefertari. The succession again went to a son by a concubine. That next son, Thutmose III, was about 10 years old when his father died. The logical regent was his aunt and stepmother, Hatshepsut, and she began to rule in his name circa 1479 BC. Within a few years, however, she decided to rule as pharaoh herself, and apparently cultivated the support of the powerful priests of the god Amun. Accompanied by a young Thutmose III, she participated in one of the great feasts honoring the god, and during the ceremonies, she had herself crowned king. Thutmose III served as a co-regent in effect, a minor king to Hatshepsut's lead. Thutmose III was probably married to his aunt's daughter, his half-sister, Nefertari, to guarantee the succession. End quote. If you're able to follow along that convoluted succession laid out in that quote, you'll be able to see that Hatshepsut taking over as pharaoh, not as queen, but pharaoh, which literally means king of Egypt. Kings are male, probably was problematic. If you take a look at what her name means, foremost of noble ladies, And you look at the fact that it's not her son or daughter on the throne, that it's her stepson, sort of, who's going to become the king of Egypt, whose mother was probably a concubine. She's probably not going to be that happy about having to hand over reign of Egypt to him when he comes of age. Or that's at least what you would think. There's actually quite a bit of 19th and 20th century prejudice that goes into the story usually, which is discussed extensively in a Smithsonian Magazine article titled The Queen Who Would Be King. In this article, the author, Elizabeth B. Wilson, discusses how the first Egyptologists of the late 19th century and early 20th century, when they did Hatshepsut's story, colored her story with their own prejudices. They're reading into it their own prejudices of a woman who wanted to take over as king and not allow her stepson from a concubine to take over and rule Egypt, that she wanted the power for herself, and she schemed to get it. Becoming the crowned pharaoh of Egypt in the New Kingdom wasn't as easy as being crowned at a feast, nor would having her reign legitimized be that easy either. Hatshepsut wanted to be pharaoh of Egypt, but to do so she would have to either change Egyptian cultural, religious, and political norms, or change herself to conform to them. It is testimony to the strength of Egyptian traditions, and probably testimony to the hardships that the Egyptian empire was currently in, that Hatshepsut decided it would be easier to conform herself to the traditions than trying to change the traditions to fit her needs. Even when conforming to those traditions would mean eschewing her femininity and taking on a role in guise that was more masculine in nature. Okay, so what exactly does that mean? Well, it probably wasn't, as some suggest, that she tried to transform herself into a man. This is often confusing to my modern sixth graders, who automatically think that she had like a sex change, because in our modern world, that is possible. Even had that option been available, I don't think that's what Hatshepsut would have done, nor what she intended. If that were the intention, then the statues we have of Hatshepsut would be noticeably different. Most notably, the statues would not have breasts, but many of them do. Hatshepsut grappled with many struggles during her 2-decade-long reign as pharaoh, and most of this, it is believed, had a lot to do with the trouble that Egypt was currently in when her husband died, and that's why she assumed reign as pharaoh, and it was important for her to have that title, even though her son was eventually going to take over. While she had great success domestically with building projects like the massive obelisks she had placed at the entrance to the temple at Karnak, and the massive and opulent mortuary complex at Deir el-Bahari, as well as successful trade missions, Hatshepsut struggled with the credibility of her reign. This issue of credibility was probably due in no small measure to her being a woman in the traditional role of a man, in a culture that reacts viscerally to attempted changes to those traditions. The initial story of Hatshepsut and her reign as pharaoh was colored by the prejudices of those first Egyptologists and archaeologists to uncover her story, like I mentioned earlier. The first discoveries of Hatshepsut's reign came in the 19th and early 20th centuries, mostly by English gentlemen, who came to the conclusion that Hatshepsut was the, quote, vilest of usurpers, and who were taken aback by the deviant behavior of being depicted as a man. They wove a story of a queen pushed aside by the lesser son of a lesser woman, who in concert with her lover and advisor Senenmut, conspired to wrest control of Egypt and change her into a man to become an all-powerful pharaoh, going so far as to have Senenmut incorporate masculine images of Hatshepsut with more masculine muscles, and the ceremonial false beard of the pharaoh, in all the temples and monuments built to honor his immoral and voracious lover. The implications that Senenmut was advanced so much further in her pharaohship than in those of Hatshepsut's predecessors, combined with the prejudice that a woman could never be so politically skillful, predisposed the first Egyptologists to study Hatshepsut in the context of, quote, deceit, lust, and revenge. The discovery of Hatshepsut through her destroyed artifacts, which evidence points to her stepson and co-regent Thutmose III destroying, did nothing to quell the imaginations of those first Egyptologists, who were already predisposed to believe the worst of one of the only female leaders of Egypt, who also had markedly great success. The Smithsonian Magazine article from 2006 that I talked about earlier, The Queen Who Would Be King, explored the kingship of Hatshepsut and the initial prejudice viewed of her, while also adding in new information, gleaned from the pages of antiquity. This was written by Elizabeth B. Wilson, as I mentioned earlier, and the quotes that I just mentioned come from that article. Ancient Egyptian pharaonic succession could be a risky and tricky business. While many of the early Egyptologists ascribed Hatshepsut's rise to power as pharaoh to an egotistical power grab, it is more likely that she had herself crowned pharaoh as a way to stabilize a tumultuous political situation, thanks to the young age and questionable parentage of her stepson Thutmose III. While Hatshepsut did have her self-declared pharaoh and depicted as pharaoh, she did likewise for her stepson. According to Elizabeth Wilson in Smithsonian Magazine, quote, monuments of the time show Thutmose III, still a child, but portrayed in the conventional manner as an adult king, performing his pharaonic duties, while Hatshepsut, dressed as queen, stands demurely off to one side. By the 7th year of her regency, however, and it may have been much earlier, the formerly slim, graceful queen appears as a full-blown, flail and crook-wielding king, with the broad bare chest of a man and the pharaonic false beard. End quote. While the depiction of herself became more male over time, this did not mean she was necessarily attempting to wrest control from her future stepson. In contrast, it is more likely this continued insistence upon her being rightly pharaoh and her stepson being the legitimate heir to her dead husband was a result of political opposition to the line of succession. In fact, quote, it's an interpretation that seems to be supported by Hatshepsut's treatment of Thutmose III during her reign. He wasn't under house arrest for those 20-odd years, says Roehrig. He was learning how to be a very good soldier. And it's not as if Hatshepsut could have stepped down when her stepson came of age. Once you took on the attributes of kingship, explains Dreyfus, that was it. You were a god. It's not queen for a day. It's king for all time. End quote. The intertwining of ruler of Egypt and status of god in the Egyptian mythology is more than likely the cause for most of the problems in Hatshepsut and Thutmose III's ascendancies to the throne. As legitimate pharaoh and god, Hatshepsut did what all previous pharaohs had done. She built monuments to herself, had inscriptions made, temples dedicated to her honor. But this legitimizing of her rule and subsequent deification is probably what drove Thutmose III to attempt to remove her from history through the destruction of her monuments. There are a few theories as to why Thutmose III took the time to destroy his stepmother's legacy late in his reign as pharaoh. One is that his own son's legitimacy might be called into question, and another may be due to the dangerous precedent set by a strong female pharaoh like Hatshepsut. From the Smithsonian Magazine article, quote, while numerous theories abound, most contemporary Egyptologists agree that the effort to delete Hatshepsut's rule has something to do with Thutmose III's concerns about the succession of power after his death. Was there some threat to the legitimacy of his own son, Amenhotep II, who in fact did succeed him? Possibly, but Dorman believes that Hatshepsut's unconventional reign may have been too successful, a dangerous precedent, best erased, he suggests, to prevent the possibility of another powerful female ever inserting herself into the long line of Egyptian male kings. End quote. Ultimately, Hatshepsut's unorthodox pharaonic rule may have been simply too successful and too much of a divergence for the intensely traditional society of the ancient Egyptians. Remember, the Egyptians were a people who simply did not like, or in any cases want, change. Like the Nile River itself, Egyptian society was to be predictable and stable, something the reign of a female pharaoh would have flown in the face of. Another great schism from Egyptian traditionalism came with the ascendancy of Amenhotep IV. In 1353 BCE, Amenhotep IV came to power with the death of his father, Amenhotep III. He came to power at a time when there was a significant rise in the power of the priests of Egypt. That power began to rival that of the pharaohs themselves. With the defeat of the Hyksos, and I feel bad for the Hyksos because they don't get mentioned very much when people discuss ancient Egyptian history because they want to focus on the Egyptians, but the Hyksos were a really interesting group who caused a lot of interesting problems for the Egyptians, as they were the first ones to really cross the desert, which the Egyptians really thought was impassable up to that point. And the coming of the New Kingdom, the god Amun began to become more and more prominent in Egyptian theology. Eventually, the god Amun was seen as being a more all-encompassing god with multiple parts, and the priests declared that Amun and Ra were actually combined into a single entity, Amun-Ra. This combining of Amun and Ra had some drastic effects on Egyptian political structure, giving the temples and priests devoted to Amun and Ra significantly larger amounts of power. When Amenhotep IV came to the throne, he wanted to see an end to this power struggle between the two, and wished to restore the pharaoh as the preeminent source of political and theocratic power in ancient Egypt. He created what is sometimes referred to as the Atenist heresy. Within a year or two of his being crowned pharaoh, Amenhotep IV had gone from continuing the traditional building of temples to Amun, as his name, meaning Amun is content, would infer, to building temples at Karnak dedicated to the Aten, a lesser god in Egyptian mythology, which is basically the god of the rays of the sun disk, or sometimes just the sun disk. He even changed his name to Akhenaten, meaning beloved of Aten. In the 5th year of his reign, a month after his name change to Akhenaten, the pharaoh arrived at the site of his new capital at Amarna, named Akhenaten. The pharaoh, Akhenaten, had decreed a new city be built on a virgin strip of land on the east side of the Nile at a site called Amarna. Akhenaten wanted to change everything about Egypt. He declared that there were no gods but Aten, and that only Akhenaten convened with the god Aten, as Aten's beloved. In this way, Akhenaten did not really create a monotheistic religion, as both the god Aten and Akhenaten were gods, and if you wanted to pray to Aten, you were instead to pray to Akhenaten. This change would have been drastic enough to send the highly traditionalist Egyptians into rapturous pulling of hair and gnashing of teeth, but Akhenaten wasn't finished there. In order to be sure his new god would be unsullied by the other now fake gods of ancient Egypt, he built his new city at Amarna with only Aten and himself and his family as deified. This new city of Akhenaten was built with brand new style construction as well. In order to build the city quickly, the Egyptian architects used uniformly cut blocks of stone that were much smaller than normal, so you could move and stack them quickly and efficiently, as opposed to the massive stones used in the more traditional style of Egyptian construction. He didn't stop there either. The Egyptians were fantastic artists, and while they did from time to time adopt the artistic stylings of others they met, such as the wet plaster fresco styles of the Minoans, as mentioned earlier, the book 1177 BCE covers the international trade of the time period, and this time period is in there. And the Egyptians had learned from Minoan traders this way of painting frescoes on wet plaster so that the paint almost blends itself directly into the wall. They did not tend to change the style of their art itself, only the format and materials used to make it. In this way, something like these wet plaster frescoes aren't changed to the actual style of art. The art still looked the same, but the manner in which it was applied to the wall and the material was changed. The artistic style used at Amarna, however, was demonstrably different, even, I would say, drastically different, than that of all other times in Egyptian history, dynastic, Ptolemaic, or otherwise. The figures were in many ways more lifelike, and for lack of a better term, more modern, not stiff and flat like the Egyptian art of other periods. It's hard to understand just how unsettling these types of changes would have been to the people of Egypt. Without things like the internet, TV, photography, mass transportation, being able to travel long distances easily, the majority of Egyptians wouldn't have been exposed to any type of architecture, art, or theology outside their own, and the institutional memory of that would go back literally over 1,000 years. To get a real feel for what that would be like, you have to think what it might be like if today iconic parts of your society and culture were suddenly changed to something extraordinarily foreign and completely unknown. If you're American, think what it would be like if a brand new capital city was built somewhere in the middle of Nebraska, but without any of the Greco-Roman inspired architecture, and instead, it was built with a brand new, never-before-seen style of architecture. Think of the most wild examples of modern art and architecture you can, and imagine an entire new city built as your capital in that way, and then your leader demanding it be the only styles of art and architecture to be used anywhere in your country. If you're European, think of the above, but replace with your own iconic buildings, perhaps Big Ben or St. Peter's. The idea that your entire phone interface, computer operating system, layout and format of television and movies have to be changed to come into line with a new and wholly alien format will be shocking and probably evoke a rather adverse reaction. This is exactly what occurred in Egypt with the Atenist heresy. Upon his death, sometime between 336 and 334 BCE, the changes wrought by Akhenaten began to rapidly unravel. Power passed to his co-regent, Smenkhare, of whom little is known. But he did not remain in power long, as power was quickly passed along to Akhenaten's son, Tutankhaten, meaning living image of Aten. The young pharaoh, probably 9 or 10 at the time of his ascendancy, was easily influenced by the regents and administrators around him, and the work to restore Egyptian society to the ways of the past and to wipe the Atenist heresy from memory occurred quickly. Indeed, by the time of his death at the age of 18, a period of only 8 to 9 years, the regents and administrators of Tutankhaten had effectively returned Egypt back to the traditional ways of their ancestors, including Tutankhaten's name, changing it to his more commonly known name of Tutankhamen, or King Tut, as he is referred to today. And that name means living image of Amun. The traditionalist nature of Egyptian society would last for millennia, even past the dynastic periods of the New Kingdom, and into the eras of decline when they would be conquered by the Persians and later the Greeks under Alexander the Great. In fact, the latter would even have himself named son of the sun god by the priests of Amun, making himself rightful pharaoh. This was in 332 BCE. The New Kingdom of Egypt is regarded as ending in 1032 BCE, after the collapse of the Bronze Age in 1177 BCE, with the collapse of the international trade at the time. It's a full 700 years after the end of an Egyptian empire that Alexander the Great is being proclaimed rightful pharaoh in a land that still mummified their dead and wrote in hieroglyphics. Even the conquering Greeks of the Ptolemy family, who would bring the Ptolemaic period of Egyptian history, became more Egyptian than they did remain Greek. They were in fact so Egyptian that the most famous Egyptian queen, Cleopatra, was in fact a Ptolemaic Greek, which you wouldn't have known by looking at her palaces, or her reign. She died in 30 BCE and effectively signaled the end to what we view as Egyptian traditions from antiquity. A combination of Roman rule and the rise of Christianity finally swept away the traditions of over 3,000 years. No other culture, from the Bronze Age, has survived as intact as that of the Egyptians after the collapse of 1177 BCE, and no other culture survived the Hellenism of Alexander the Great's empire as intact as the Egyptians. It is a testament to the strength of their traditions that their culture survived so many attempts to alter it in significant ways, and it's difficult for us today to truly grasp just how unique that is. I hope you enjoyed this episode of History in Context, A Brief History of the World. As always, make sure you give us a like on Facebook and follow along on your favorite podcast app on your phone or mobile device so that you get notified when new episodes come out.